guest host for Point of View.
Welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Round Table today. I'm your host, Chelsey Youman, and I'm here to just talk about a whole host of issues we have for you today. Lots going on the public scene. But before we get there, we've got Jonathan Teague in the studio with us, joining us from Prestonwood Baptist Church. He is the minister to married adults, and they let us borrow him for the afternoon. So thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
It's good to be back in the studio, Chelsey. Good to see you.
Good to see you. A little bit later in the next hour, we'll have Ben Courson joining us by phone. But before we get there, we've got a few topics we're going to discuss. We're going to start with, I don't want it to be a theme day, but I've been getting into themes as I've been doing the show with you guys, because I think there's so many ways to tie all of the things going on in the public realm and in politics and in our culture right now. There's some common themes happening. And so the first thing we're going to talk about today is how the left or Democrats are trying to redefine words to really accomplish their goals, and it's a really effective tool, really, and what Fox News called political warfare. So we're going to start there, and we're going to talk a little bit later in the show, of course, about the big jury verdict that was reached yesterday. Peacemakers and police officers being dispatched to cover the protests that they were prepared for in response to that, and then a little bit later we'll talk about court packing and Planned Parenthood finally condemning their founder, but was that condemnation enough? They condemned her for her racist eugenics roots. So we'll unpack all of that later in the show today. But thank you for joining us. Our audience, you can read about these topics or more on pointofview.net. But let's go ahead and jump right in. So Fox News had an article I really thought was interesting because it's something that I'm sure many of us have noticed as we watch the news or are paying attention to things happening in our world, where just terms are being utilized in new and different ways. Or if you're reading an article and you're like me and you read 5 articles for every one, trying to grapple with all the facts, you'll read something and you'll say, wait a minute, this sounds a little bit funny, or this is this really what this is about? And the more research you do, inevitably you pull the string or the yarn and it all unravels. And so the first article we're going to talk about today is how Democrats are using redefining words like court packing, infrastructure, bipartisan, just to name a few, as a very effective tool for political warfare. And one of the reasons for that is by redefining terms that maybe before get a negative connotation or maybe neutralizes what would be a really extreme position. And it does a few things. It hides the ball for the public. So the public hears the word infrastructure and they think that's a great thing. But then you pull at that yarn, and really what it includes is free child care, more increased unemployment rates. When they start baking those things into the cake, you find out that it's not really what it's about. So it's really a misleading, some would say lying effort, but it's something that misleads people, and I think creates a public narrative and some real force behind their efforts that are difficult to reckon with or claw back. And we've seen this before. So I'll take one great example. Planned Parenthood consistently use this method to quote unquote repackage or remarket abortion. So Margaret Sanger was famous for saying, if we can get Black pastors in Brooklyn on board with what we're going to call family planning instead of abortion, if we get their stamp of approval and everybody starts calling abortion family planning, we're in business. And that's exactly what happened. And they repackaged it to be a feminist cause. And then they repackaged it most recently to be called health care or reproductive health. And we know that abortion hasn't changed over the last few decades. It is the killing of an innocent life. So in this article, they talk about a few things we'll get to in just a second. But off the cuff, Jonathan, when you read this, or what are your thoughts about this I don't know, it's a marketing technique or a political tool?
Yeah, it seems like so much of the political discourse now is all driven around semantics, which has always been the case, right? So I have a mentor in my life that likes to say that words matter, which is true, and they do. But with so much juxtaposition and so much sort of tribalism as it relates to progressive and conservative or Republican, Democrat. Of course, like, for instance, yesterday, we'll probably get into this later, but, you saw the primer was set yesterday with the Chauvin trial, and had that gone a different way, all of the skepticism around what might have happened. But it was interesting. I saw one video yesterday on social media where there was a guy in Minneapolis on the street, and he was screaming, saying, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm a revolutionary. So I think a lot of this, Chelsey, is driven around the labeling that's superimposed on the problems. So like, say, for instance, we have an infrastructure problem, and we clearly do. I mean, Bob Dole was talking about this in 1996. The idea that crumbling bridges or, roads that aren't as efficient as they could be, transit, all those kinds of things. Yeah, that's a problem. But we've taken the problem, it seems, and based off your political identity, we slap a label on what it really is. We, like you said, we repackage it into a word that's very sellable politically, and then it sounds very moral. And so all of a sudden, if you oppose infrastructure, reform, well, then you hate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you're against this, this, and this. And it's an easy way to corrupt political discourse, or just, community dialogue for that matter. And it turns people against each other inherently. A great example of this is what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez continues to do. She's a pro at this, and she's going to get elected potentially again by a constituency where she's learned to weaponize words. And she did it yesterday walking out of the Capitol. Same kind of idea. So I'm really troubled by the labeling over the problem. Like, why can't we unpack the problem?
Right.
Why do we have to create identity around it?
Right. Well, I think that it's been an effective tool for quite a while. Nothing is new under the sun.
Sure.
And so we saw these methods employed even back in 2015 over the same-sex marriage discourse culturally, where all of a sudden there were some big labels and, frankly, name-calling being thrown out. Christians were being called everything under the sun, from bigot to hater, and then they started some hashtags. And before we knew it, you were opposed to love and humans if you had traditional biblical views on marriage. And that had a really devastating impact. What you're talking about, giving the other side that moral high ground, enabled people to be fired for their religious beliefs at best. Many were given death threats. I know the organization I worked for had regular death threats coming in just because of their views, their traditional views. But instead of talking about the issue, it became a labeling game. And that was enough to really, I think, not to overuse the word marginalize, but really make people quieter. And we saw the same thing with them, not really the Me Too movement, but in a way that snowballed into such a big thing. Definitely Black Lives Matter. Really all of those terms became, we can't talk about the issues because to talk about it means that they were calling everybody a racist, right? And it's really problematic because anyone who, if you're a Christian or I'm a Christian and I deeply care about racial division and injustice, that's what I've dedicated my career to. But to engage in a conversation about the facts of things that are happening, a young woman was killed recently as of this week, but she had a knife in her hand and was stabbing someone else. Well, if we engage in that discussion about what was really happening there and the validity of or invalidity of the policeman's actions, now we're in hot water because of the labeling we're in. And so you're right. I think it does a disservice. We're going to go to a break pretty quickly, but when we get back, we're going to unpack some of the most recent relabeling or redefining of words that we've seen out of the Biden administration, just so that you guys as our listeners and we can all be aware of it. When you hear these buzzwords, do they mean what they mean on their face? Do they mean what they traditionally meant? Or maybe we should do a little more due diligence, a little more research, and unpack what packing the courts really means. So when we get back after this, we'll continue this discussion and more with Jonathan Teague.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
3 major scientific discoveries in the past century point to God. That is the arguments Dr. Stephen Meyer makes in a recent commentary in The Federalist, which is based on his new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. The first significant discovery is that the physical universe likely had a beginning. That is contrary to the expectations of scientific materialists who assumed that the material universe was eternal and thus self-existent. Scientists discovered that galaxies far from the Earth were receding faster than those close at hand. This observed red shift demonstrated that the universe was expanding from an initial Big Bang. Later evidence also confirmed these observations that contradicted the expectation of scientific materialists and confirmed those of traditional theists. A second point is that physicists have discovered that we live in a kind of Goldilocks universe. Scientists are finding fundamental physical laws and parameters of our universe that have been finely tuned, against all odds, to make our universe capable of hosting life. Now, this points to the possibility that a cosmic fine-tuner exists. Former Cambridge astrophysicist Sir Fred Hoyle argued that a common-sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics to make life possible. And third, discoveries in molecular biology have revealed the presence of digital code in the foundation of life. This suggests a master programmer behind the genetic structure of DNA. Bill Gates acknowledged that DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. These three scientific discoveries all point to the existence of a creator God. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host for the Millennial Round Table today, and I'm joined by, now that I know it, it's Dr. Jonathan Teague. He just finished his doctorate, which I think I knew, but I just asked him what he got his doctorate in, and he said it was in Doctor of Education, but it was in what I'm calling millennial science.
That's a fair way of putting it.
So we're going to tap into your doctorate today as we talk about millennials and how they're being marketed to. But really, we have been discussing the Biden administration just repackaging, using marketing to really redefine words and what their traditional meanings are. I really personally am passionate about this because I think it's already an uphill battle to get information in this day and age and to get accurate, objective, truthful, factual information that isn't completely biased. And then on top of that, from the top, the people that are running our government to be hiding the ball and redefining words is a problem for me because I just want to know what's going on. And if you're like me, that's a hard thing to find out. Do you have time to do all the research you need to really understand what all is being baked into the cake at the federal level or really at many levels? So I care about information. I care about free flow of that. So feel free to correct me if any of my information is wrong. But we'll start with the first one is they've redefined infrastructure. Traditionally, when we think of infrastructure, everyone thinks about, the roads, bridges, just some of the basic staples of society that really is a bipartisan thing everybody can get behind. And I know that the GOP is even supporting a scaled back version of the infrastructure plan. So infrastructure is something that creates jobs. It's good. But once you really look into the Biden administration's $400 billion proposal, it includes home care for elderly, it includes free child care, it includes paid leave, it includes all kinds of caregiving as now infrastructure. They're adding a new Department of Commerce, which was already one of the biggest administrations in the administrative state. They're adding a new department there. So it really, when you scale it back, only about 6% of Biden's plan goes into traditional infrastructure, 6%, and the rest would include a revamp of all of the environmental issues they care about are now baked into the cake, getting out of oil and gas. So that's the first one. Did you want to add anything to that, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I mean, what fun is it to just rebuild bridges? We gotta trick it out, right? So it's like
solar bridges.
Right, yeah, right. And I think what's interesting about this too, that young adults need to pay attention to as you think about being an informed voter, and particularly if you're trying to vote and be civically engaged through a Christian worldview, you need to pay attention to what things are being called and how they're being codified, because to pull this off is going to require your tax dollars. So every time you kind of just sort of wink and nod as it goes by, you're subsidizing these things that are not just economic, they're moral in nature. I mean, they 100% are. And so the subsidization around, for instance, childcare or, community center revitalization, that's a big thing. And the tech sector is pouring tons of money sort of side by side with the government. Or they're buying out government contracts to sort of re-engineer, community centers and things like that. Now, that sounds on the surface like a great idea. When you find out some of the agendizing behind that, it's really troubling, because it's going to up in the school system. It's sort of it's kind of an underhanded way of slapping down the teachers' unions. So it feels very disjointed, right? And so it goes back to our previous conversation. If you're not high-fiving it, you must hate this or this. You must not be on board.
You don't like bridges. And
yeah,
roads.
you don't want kids to read, or you don't want moms to be able to go to work full time, or dads be. Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. But when you agendize the morality behind it and then you tuck it away, this isn't like FDR saying, "Hey, we're going to go put unemployed men to work," to keep people from living in Hoovervilles. This is a little different deal, and it's I think, honestly, Chelsey, a part of it, maybe a big part of it, is a backdoor way to really usher in the climate change agenda, which is really, really troubling and massively expensive.
Right. And I think even the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, said it would cost $1 million of jobs in Texas alone. And Texas has one of the last thriving economies right now. I mean, people are migrating to Texas in droves because of the way that they've protected the economy and the current infrastructure they have there in Texas. And so just to be mindful and aware is a good thing. If you hear the buzzword infrastructure, now you know that that's going to include a whole additional new, what they're saying, well, it's time to revitalize the meaning of infrastructure. And let's just be honest about it then. Let's just have the conversation. So the next big word that they talked about redefining is bipartisan. It used to mean that elected officials who were Democrats and elected officials who were Republican were both on board with a policy or initiative. It's a great thing to have a bipartisan effort and to get people from all sides of the aisle on board. Well, now we're finding out that what the Biden administration has done is they'll get a poll done where some of the Republican voters, the mainstream public, will say, yeah, we would support that initiative, loosely defined initiative like infrastructure. And then now they'll take it back and say we have bipartisan support for this initiative. And because we have bipartisan support in the public opinion side of things, we don't need to work across the aisle to make this a real deal bipartisan initiative on paper. And so things are sailing through Congress right now without any input whatsoever from a Republican. And that's not really how things should operate when almost half of Congress is Republican. They should be reaching across the aisle saying, do you care about that? Where are areas we can agree on? What are your thoughts on that one, Jonathan?
Well, yeah, because again, it goes back to if you were the big kid in fifth grade, like everybody wanted to be on your team because you can beat them up. And so like when you have a majority or you have a physical majority, whatever it may be, it's very Darwinian in one sense, because it's like whoever's got the most votes is going to win. Well, yeah, that's true. You're reaping something, though, or you're sowing something you're going to reap, though, I think, politically. And we watched this happen to some extent in the early 2000s with the George Bush era. And we saw sort of the knee jerk with Nancy Pelosi's first House speakership, and how all of that hinged so quick that really kind of opened the door for what Barack Obama's original policies, the Health Care Act, all those kinds of things. And a decade later, here we are again. Like, there's just an absolute refusal to work together on almost anything. Because, again, if you believe, Chelsey, that your constituency, and whether this is true or not, I don't think it always is, by the way. I think what we have right now is we're seeing a lot of politicians that set the narrative for their constituents, and constituents kind of go, yeah, okay. Or they're just they're banking on people's disengagement. And so as a result, you've got people, I love that phrase, it's sailing through, like stuff that we'd be shocked if you looked at the legislative agenda nationally today, the stuff that's being voted on right up into the Senate. And the only reason it's not rubber stamped all the way to the White House is because the Senate is putting up a fight on it. But it just brings you back to another point, and I was having a conversation with some leaders about this yesterday. Elections matter. Like they do.
They really do. And
local, national, they all matter.
But in this election, I thought it was really interesting because not only did it obviously matter, but your other in Georgia, for instance, let's look at Georgia.
That's a great example.
Certain specific elections tainted the entire field. And so even in Texas, I had a duty to vote based on if we lose Georgia, we're going to lose this. The Republicans will lose the Senate majority, and there's no stopgap between the White House and everything they want to pass through Congress. And so being aware of not just your election, but what is the makeup in the Senate and what is the makeup in the House and how will these votes impact that? It's some big picture stuff. So a few other things you might have noticed recently in the news. Riots have now been called peaceful protests. Illegal aliens are now called undocumented non-citizens. These are just buzzwords, again, what you're saying, to control the narrative. But I think it's just important for truth to rise to the surface, to continue to have discussions, to continue to engage. And the last one, before we go to a break, I'll talk about is court packing. And this one I am obviously particularly passionate about because I'm an attorney and nothing's more stressful to me than court packing.
It's a really important topic, too.
It's a very important topic, which we are going to talk about after the break. But before we go there, the most recent flashpoint in the war over words is the meaning of court packing. The term was coined in the 1930s by former President Franklin D. Roosevelt out of frustration with the Supreme Court's rulings on his New Deal. So he pushed a plan to increase the number of justices who would most likely be able to support his political policies. Well, now what we've seen, some of the Democrats who filed legislation even as recently as last week, and there's a commission designated to court packing, and the legislation would add 4 justices to the Supreme Court. They're saying Republicans packed the court when Mitch McConnell held Garland's seat open for nearly a year before the election. Amy Coney Barrett's her nomination and confirmation to the court they called court packing. Republicans have already packed the Supreme Court. This is unpacking it. So I just want to clarify here because federal court vacancies, there is one of the few things the president must do is nominate judges to the federal courts when there are vacancies. And so that's a constitutional mandate and something the president has been granted explicit authority over. So by filling those vacancies, he's fulfilling a duty and he's not packing a court. Packing a court is when you add judges or justices like President Roosevelt tried to do in the 1930s. Increasing the total number at the end. And so I'm sure our audience knew that. But if you hear that the Republicans court packed, that's not actually true. Democrats are going to be attempting that soon. More on that when we return after the break. So stay tuned.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media, and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Round Table, and I'm joined by Jonathan Teague, who is a doctor. Dr. Teague is with us in the house. He has a doctorate in millennial science, is what I'm calling it, but really he's a millennial whisperer. He does great work with Prestonwood Baptist Church. So thank you for joining us in studio today, Jonathan.
It's great to be here, Chelsey.
Yeah, it's been good. We've been unpacking, not to have a pun already out of the chute, but we've been talking about how Democrats are using effective tools, especially out of the administration, to kind of redefine traditional terms that people neutralizes their policies. Right. And we talked a lot about that. So you can read about that or more at pointofview.net. You can also be listening live, Point of View Radio on Facebook. But we're going to turn now to court packing, which I know there's a lot going on in the media news cycle, especially this week. So we wanted to make sure that this one didn't get buried in the news cycle and brought it to the light. Later in the show, we'll be, of course, talking about the jury reaching a verdict in the Chauvin trial, and then some of the peacemakers that were dispatched in Minneapolis, and talking about police reform and those things that are now on the table, or have been really for a little while now. Yeah. But before we get there, we're going to talk about the commission. We all have heard of President Biden appointing a 36-member commission to evaluate the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is currently configured of 9 justices. It has been that way for, probably over 100 years now. I'd have to go back and look.
About 140 years.
140 years.
Yeah.
There was a point in time in the 1930s where President Franklin D. Roosevelt got frustrated that his policies weren't going through and making it past the Supreme Court. And he really created big federal government and took it to the next level. So he attempted once upon a time to pack the courts, and that was a failed attempt. And he's been largely criticized on both sides of the aisle for that attempt. As recently as Justice Ginsburg saying a few years ago, we think 9 is a good number. There's no need to increase the number of justices on the court. So the fact that President Biden has even begun this commission for the first time in 90 years to consider this question, it's a big deal. This is a landmark issue. It's huge, and I'm gonna explain why, but I'll continue to give a few background facts first. So there's a 36-member commission looking at reforming the court. And then Democrats, also some outlier Democrats, did file a piece of legislation last week requesting to add 4 seats to the Supreme Court immediately. And that would include, the court packing issue would also include not just adding justices and more seats, but setting term limits for justices. So that's a big buzzword. We're going to talk about that in a second as well. The commission is already up and running. The biggest problem is it's largely composed of attorneys from the American Constitution Society. None of them are practicing attorneys. None of them are historians. They're all constitutional professors, essentially. And that's problematic because, of course, the Supreme Court hears so much more than just constitutional issues. And this does have a large bearing on the constitutional division of separation of powers. But because if you're not a practicing attorney, it really limits your ability to see that the court decides all kinds of issues, criminal issues, habeas corpus issues, things completely unrelated to the Constitution. And so you would want to know what impact increasing their number would have on the other issues. So let's stop there. Jonathan, this is a big issue. We just said it's one we all need to really be paying attention to. Yeah. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that makes the American experience so unique is, and you just alluded to it, is our ability to have a government that functions separately but equally in authority. And the Supreme Court is, one scholar has put it this way, paraphrase, the Supreme Court is the great fail-safe if the federal government ever goes crazy. So you actually want the Supreme Court on your team as it relates to you as an American citizen. It is your highest recourse that, in a sense, can function as a federal rebuke for the other branches. It's really cool to have at your disposal as a citizen. The problem that the founders wrestled with, parenthetically here, is that they never wanted a massive tribunal, right? They didn't like the French system. They hated the English system. It was all convoluted with the parliamentary system. They wanted an independent judiciary that the executive branch nominated, the Senate confirmed, and that essentially was the final arbiter when things got a little out of control. And the Supreme Court was really this dormant thing for a long time. It handled like these key seminal cases, and then you wouldn't hear much from them. But like in the last 2 decades of the 21st century, it has become, for a lot of people, sort of the solution to every political problem. And to me, Chelsey, this is the epitome of political hubris. When you didn't get your way with the previous administration and you lost 2 seats, this is how you get it back. Since you can't upend lifetime appointments for 2 of the other guys' people, right? Because that creates a precedent to then say, well, then why should all of these other, why does Sotomayor get to be a lifetime appointee? Well, the only other way to circumvent that is, because you don't want to lose your other seats you have, is you go add more. It's political hubris, and it's really, really, really problematic.
I think it's really dangerous. That's a great way to put it, political hubris, because to me, I look at this and I think, what more do Democrats want? They have the White House. Right. They have a majority, ostensibly a majority in the Senate and the House. They're able to pass legislation quickly and effectively, and they are doing so at record speed. Right. The only branch of government they don't have in their favor right now is the Supreme Court. And so to upend the Constitution, because this is about separation of powers. And so the Supreme Court's role is to interpret legislation and make sure that it's constitutional or not, say it thumbs up, thumbs down. It's a very limited role, and it's supposed to be completely nonpartisan. It's the only unelected branch of government. We can vote for Congress, we can vote for our president, but we cannot vote for justices. And that's for a very important reason. It's to insulate the Supreme Court from partisan divide. Objectivity. Objectivity. Right. And so you can argue, of course, which I mean, a lot do, that there's no such thing as really an objective justice or a judge, but neutrality is the goal. And so that is why there's a lifetime appointment for any federal branch judge. There is a lifetime appointment, not just the Supreme Court. And that is because by forcing judges, let's say they resign every 4 years, now you're at the complete mercy of the partisan appointment of whoever is president. And so we've now politicized the Supreme Court for forever. There's no limit to that. Into perpetuity. Into perpetuity. That's right. And so our only last fail-safe for a neutral branch of government is now politicized and really under the complete power and control of the presidency, which is problematic for me because I think the executive branch should be an equal branch to the others. I don't think that it should. We're supposed to have checks and balances, and this largely weights in favor of a vastly expanded, powerful executive branch, and that's something conservatives traditionally oppose. So it's like it's in one sense, if you're listening to this, particularly if you're a younger person and you're thinking about like, well, does all this stuff really matter? It universally does. Because, like, for instance, in the 1930s, if Franklin Roosevelt just gets 2 of some of his Great Society programs passed through the Supreme Court that didn't make it, the Quad C, for instance, didn't make it, it would have upended how we were prepared to be the economic force for World War II that we were. Supreme Court knew enough to know that. He was essentially creating a federal trust. Like, think of it this way, like he was creating an Apple, like a corporation called the federal government that would become the universal employer. Humongous, massive problem, right? And so the Supreme Court has always been that buffer, that wedge that protects the American citizenry in one sense from itself. It becomes the mind of constitutional interpretation. It's really, really, really important. And by the way, let's not miss here that if your number one fear in 2020 was that Donald Trump would appeal to the Supreme Court for a victory, what's one of the ways to circumvent that in 2024? Have a packed court that you can ensure you placed to protect you from a Supreme Court reaction if you don't like your election results. Or a Supreme Court reaction from anything unconstitutional you might be doing as of late. I mean, I think let's connect. I do want to continue on this because I really liked what you said about connecting. What if the Supreme Court is politicized? Well, one of the issues is that by requiring lifetime appointments, that means it is extremely rare that the shift of the Supreme Court, let's say conservative or Democrat leaning, it takes decades for that to shift back and forth. And so it's a slow moving machine. I think that the conservative appointed judges just now took a majority for the first time in decades. And so what that means is importantly, that our constitutional rights are slow to progress and move and change, which for conservatives is good. We want the Constitution to remain in place and steadfast. Politics moves quickly. We file legislation quickly. We're largely reactive. We're really bent on culture. The Supreme Court think the opposite. Think it took
slow.
It's taken us in a bad way 48 years, and Roe versus Wade is still not overturned in spite of changing public opinions and state legislatures. But if that issue was gun rights, you would be happy about that as a conservative and saying, okay, our rights are protected. So having a slow mechanism that does not change with the tides of culture as quickly, it does change over time, but we're talking 50-year, 100-year increments instead of 2 and 4 year increments. And I think that stabilizing force in society and culture and politics is necessary.
Yeah.
When we get back, we're going to keep talking about packing the Supreme Courts, the potential for that on the horizon, and the ramifications for us in society.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm your host today for the Millennial Round Table. I'm Chelsey Youman, and I've got Dr. Jonathan Teague with me in studio. We've been unpacking court packing and really just breaking it down from my legal perspective, a cultural perspective, the impact that could have, because it's a potential on the horizon. I think President Biden did play coy when he ran for office and said, I'll neither confirm nor deny that that's on the table. And now we know it's very much on the table. There's a 36-person appointed commission who are looking at term limits and increasing the size of the Supreme Court. We've also got a piece of legislation that was filed last week by some outlier Democrats. I'm saying outlier because Speaker Pelosi did say she would not put a court packing bill on the floor, but the legislation would seek to add 4 spots to the Supreme Court effective immediately. And so we did talk about the vast implications for separation of powers that would have, especially for an executive branch that already has partisan control of the White House. We've got Democrat-run control of Congress. Politicizing the Supreme Court is just a huge power grab. We've also talked a little bit about term limits and how that politicizes the court. And I'm going to shore up our discussion there so we can talk about what we spoke about on the break, which is some of the historical cautionary tales that we should be aware of when we're talking about packing the courts. But I will just say one additional thing about politicizing the courts and making Supreme Court justices either have to run again to be, I don't know that the word would be reelected, but reappointed every few years by giving them term limits instead of the current lifetime appointments that they have, is that now you have justices who they do care deeply, and judges at the federal level, at the lower court levels, they care deeply about their role.
Right.
So now what would they need to do to be reappointed? They would need to garner political favor, and that would be with whomever is going to be in charge to reappoint them. And so now you've got them, instead of from the neutral standpoint, supposedly, of looking at a law, comparing it with the Constitution, and deciding a case on more neutral, principled grounds, you've got them vying for political favor in those decisions and making sure their decisions look a certain way. So I think that in addition to the power grab, in addition to permanently changing the Constitution and granting the executive branch tons of power, which is scary, we've what I would say is fully politicized our judges. And if you think they're politicized now, you have no idea how neutral they really try to be. So that's a big thing. And then the second thing would be, I think that it's an effort to intimidate the current justices on the Supreme Court. We're going to talk about abortion because that is the number one reason when people think about the makeup of the Supreme Court. One of the number one reasons they're concerned about it on the left is they talk about abortion and the rights to abortion. And they know that Roe versus Wade, it's hanging on by a thread. There's terrible legal reasoning behind it. It's being challenged as quickly as possible up the ranks in the lower courts. State after state legislature is passing abortion regulations in attempts to challenge Roe. And so it's on the horizon. It just is. And that's why Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, they were so apoplectic on the left about losing Justice Ginsburg's seat to a Republican appointee. And so I have heard rumors that the attempt is really to intimidate the Supreme Court out of making any big moves on cases that would make the left mad. Because if they care about the legitimacy of the court, they care that it's not compromised or politicized through court packing. So let's not do anything that's going to make the executive branch too upset, because if they're upset, they're gonna harm our court system. And so I really want our public to know that and be aware of that. I think there's a very important abortion case out of the Fifth Circuit, Dobbs, working its way up. We're waiting on the Supreme Court to grant it. It's an important vehicle to resolve a lot of abortion issues, but the Supreme Court has paused for months and months and months on whether they're going to grant cert. And I can't help but think that this court packing threat is a threat and that it is something that's cause for concern. So Jonathan, I laid out a lot for you, but I wanted to take it there and get your thoughts.
I mean, there's so many variables. If you think about, you start talking about term limits for lifetime appointments. You've created, you're a lawyer. Legal precedent is king. So you start creating term limits for Supreme Court justices. You've introduced the term limit conversation across the board federally. So in other sectors or spots or spaces where that is still sort of this sacred thing, and it's unique to our system, this lifetime appointment thing is we don't give it to our president. We sure don't give it to our congressman. And the longest you can serve in the federal government, most people forget civics 9th grade, is your senator, which is 6 years. And that's all for a reason. That's all designed in that bicameral kind of way that the founders had to balance things, to balance the rhetoric and the legislative momentum so that no one branch can just steamroll another. Well, you introduce term limits into the Supreme Court. You've pulled that prop out, and which is you have essentially, like you said, that's so true. You have hyper politicized because number one, you're going to create a legal rush. All of a sudden, I've got a 4-year window or 2. How long is the term? Who sets the term? Who curates that? How do you constitutionally incorporate that? There's so many. No wonder Nancy Pelosi doesn't want this on the floor right now. She knows it is a constitutional nightmare to make it happen. Nobody just signs the pen on this when it's done. There are so many layers to this. But the other problem too, Chelsey, I think we talked about this off air, is when you start creating the makeup of the court as no longer a court in the traditional sense of the American understanding of the constitutional understanding, but you start to convert it into a tribunal, right? You start to make that body bigger, and the larger it becomes, the less objective it'll naturally be. That's human science 101. Let me give you a great example. Go to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And if you want to recreate culture and you want to rewrite law, Hitler figured out very quickly that it's much simpler for her to take his National Socialistic agenda and codify it legally if he had the courts weaponized, and he did. That's what he did. And by the mid-1930s, there was no legal recourse for you as a German citizen. So if you didn't want to if you opposed Nazification in Austria, you found yourself in front of a German tribunal, and more often than not, you were condemned one way or another. Now you might say, well, that's an extreme example. Well, but it's not hard to get there. One of the ways you do it culturally is you just start to shift the makeup of your judiciary context. That's one of the fundamental problems of packing the court, as it were, which is a made-up term. And that just is. The only way you pack the court is if all 9 of the Supreme Court justices unilaterally politically agree with you, which, wait for it, has never happened in the American story and really isn't built to happen, which, again, it becomes our best friend as a citizenry because we know we have legal recourse.
Right. I think that's a very important cautionary tale because we can look at history. Nothing is new under the sun. We already said earlier in this show, and to say we know that it would vastly expand the power of politicians and politics, the executive branch. There was a reason the Constitution designed lifetime appointments the way that they are. And so I think from a conservative principled standpoint, conservative principles say, let's stay within the confines of the Constitution. Our founding fathers saw a lot of cautionary tales from the countries they came from and from the countries we fought. And to say, let's learn from that and create a really balanced system. I mean, it is in human nature to power grab. It is in government nature. It's always to expand, get more money, tax more, be more entrenched and involved in our lives. I would personally love for the federal government to get out of my life. I don't want to think about them as much as I do, but when Vice President Kamala Harris said, I think about you guys at night, I was like, please don't. Like, we don't want the federal government involved, but this is something to be aware of. So I would encourage you guys, Republicans, not all the Democrats are on board with this. A lot of the more mainstream and neutral ones are not. So if you are a Republican, sadly represented, you're sad because you're represented by a Democrat, call your senator, call your representative who is a Democrat, and see if you as a Republican can say, hey, we want this not to go to the floor. We don't want this to be something we're voting on, and try to get some ear. So I would encourage you to contact your elected officials and representatives. There's no telling what the commission will do, but there is at least some legislation on the House floor or on the House right now side. And so feel free to lobby your Democrats who represent you about things you care about. So don't forget, we're going to go to a break quickly, but you can go to pointofview.net to read about these topics or more. When we get back, you may have heard that the jury reached a verdict in the Chauvin trial. So we'll definitely be breaking that issue down, talking about some of the cultural ramifications for police, for our communities, when we get back shortly after this.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media, and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Round Table, and we've got some great topics on the show today. Before we get there, we also have Jonathan Teague in the studio with us. He is the minister to married adults from Prestonwood Baptist Church. They let us borrow him this afternoon from ministering to adults to ministering to you all. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Teague.
Oh, it's good to be here, Chelsey. I'm loving the conversation.
Me too. Me too. Also this hour, we have by phone, we have Ben Courson on the line. And Ben, we don't ever know where you're joining us from. Where are you today? Oh, he's not on the line. Oh.
Yep, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Ben. Welcome.
I'm actually coming from good old Costa Mesa, and it's supposed to be sunny here, and it's not. It's cloudy, so the struggle is real, but I'm rejoicing.
Oh, I know you guys aren't used to your clouds over there, but here today, it's actually been in Texas, where we're from, it's been like 43 degrees today, so it's been weird here too, but thanks for joining us, Ben.
Well, then I really can't complain. So I'm stoked to be here. We're going to have a fun hour.
Yes, we are. Well, this hour, we're going to talk a little bit about the jury verdict that was reached in the Chauvin trial yesterday, a historic moment. We're also going to talk a little bit about the police that were dispatched, the National Guard, and what we've as a country have really been seeing over the last year. I kind of want to have the broader discussion about police reform that's being proposed across the country. And then we'll end the hour talking about Planned Parenthood, who took their sweet time about it, but finally renounced their racist founder's roots. Margaret Sanger was a known eugenist. They renounced her, but I've got a few things to say on the subject, so we're going to talk about it. So let's start. You can read about any of these topics or more at pointofview.net. You can also watch us live at Point of View Radio on Facebook. Now let's turn to the trial. I'm sure that most of our listeners, you guys are aware, but I believe it's a really important moment in the racial tensions in our country, as do so many people, because George Floyd's trial for his death, and Officer Chauvin, who is the one responsible for his death, the trial ended yesterday, and the jury did convict him on all 3 counts of murder and manslaughter. And so I think we'll probably still have some sentencing to hear. We're not sure how long he'll go away for, but it's going to look like a number of years. And all of the country's eyes were on Minneapolis, where this trial was held, because there has been so much unrest. I mean, we know, we all feel it. But President Biden came out earlier this week saying that he would hope that the quote unquote right verdict was reached. We know he'd been in touch with George Floyd, the victim's brother, and, given him his condolences. And so I think that the expectation with a guilty verdict is that the country can take a deep breath a little bit here, and that maybe it will be cause for some healing. I'll confess, I can't speak specifically to the trial because I didn't get to watch a lot of it. So if either of you really want to talk about some of the things you saw in the trial, I would love to hear it. So let's start with you, Ben. I know that you've been reading the news too. What were your initial thoughts about the trial or the verdict that was reached?
Well, one of the convictions was second-degree murder, and I agree with you. I had the same reaction. I really feel like this will be healing balm for our nation right now. And the book of Amos has this beautiful prophetic line, "Let justice roll down like a river." And my thoughts on it is that's really what's happening right now. So, again, one of the convictions being second-degree murder, when I read that, I read it right when it came out. my heart rejoiced because I think that for the African American community, this is going to be one step toward one step toward healing in this long process that we're in.
Yes, it has certainly been a long process. It happened a little bit over a year ago, which in terms of trials, I mean, I think it's relatively fast. They were able to have a trial this quickly, but
that's true.
Thousands and thousands have taken to the streets, either in protest or in waiting for this verdict to be reached. I mean, we've heard stories, you'll see in the articles we posted, about people weeping and crying, and just feeling like this is such a terrible thing that happened, but could there be justice? So I believe I read that 6 of the jurors were white, 6 of the jurors were of a different ethnicity. And so hopefully, that people felt like there was at least some racial representation and diversity in the actual jurors themselves, but then ultimately them coming to reach this verdict, I think is telling. It's very different than in the early 90s when the race riots started in LA. What really catapulted that was jury verdicts going the other way with King's trial. So Rodney King, what are your thoughts, Jonathan?
I remember being 13, 14 years old and watching that. On TV. And then a few years later, this dude named O.J. Simpson and that whole catharsis nationally. So, I mean, Ben makes an important observation. There is undoubtedly, whether you talk about in the sports community or in the business community, I mean, it was interesting to watch yesterday on Twitter, the number of athletes, then the number of teams, then the number of cities and businesses who made a point in that moment. And it was a culture moment. To make sure that they were on record, and I think this is a really big deal, that they were on record in that cultural moment standing with the guilty verdict. All right, so zoom out as a Christian for a second. Did Derek Chauvin's negligence as police officer, and I think that's part of what it was, Chelsey, I mean, legally, I maybe I'm using the wrong term there, but was how Derek Chauvin chose to handle that arrest morally reprehensible as police officer to the degree that he ended George Floyd's life? Jury of his peers says, yes, it was. 3 different ways it was. So was he guilty? That jury says yes. The video sure does seem to show it. And the tragic outcry that came from it culturally and nationally really seems to affirm that. So in one sense, here's what we have to ask ourselves. This is the question. Did Derek Chauvin really have a chance? Like, was that jury going to conclude anything other than that? And what we have to wrestle with on one end objectively is, are we okay? Because here's what Vice President Harris was saying, and what a lot of people were clapping back at yesterday. This is a good step, but the system still has to be reformed. That's interesting. What about it needs to be reformed? Because if justice was served, then and you're saying no, it wasn't. Because I agree with what Ben's saying. But then the question, the very next statement is, yeah, but there's more to do. There's more to do. There's more to do. And I think if we don't quickly get our arms around what that more is, I think we're creating a very, very tempestuous context for how we're unpacking racial issues, which there's more to come for sure. It's going to happen.
Right. It's funny you mentioned that because that happens to be our next topic. So after we go to a break here in the next minute, we'll definitely be talking about that. I think it's important what you mentioned, though, the fairness of the jury. Look, I didn't sit in the trial. I didn't hear all the evidence. I'm sure they were presented very well on both sides. And so it's one thing to look at the facts of this specific case, but it's a whole nother thing to do what you're mentioning, which is to project it onto society as a whole and reform as a whole. And I think conservative philosophy traditionally tends to be, if there is an issue, eradicate that issue. Liberal philosophy tends to say, conservatives say reform. Liberal philosophy says revolutionize. Right. If there's an issue, you must eradicate the whole. And so I think we're going to see that in this context. We see it in most political contexts as well. So we are going to go to one of those breaks, but when we get back, we'll continue to talk about the jury. Did the President Biden play a role because of his comments in the outcome? And then, of course, the larger impact for society, culture, politics from the verdict that was rendered yesterday. So stay tuned.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
three major scientific discoveries in the past century point to God. That is the arguments Dr. Stephen Meyer makes in a recent commentary in The Federalist, which is based on his new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. The first significant discovery is that the physical universe likely had a beginning. That is contrary to the expectations of scientific materialists who assumed that the material universe was eternal and thus self-existent. Scientists discovered that galaxies far from the Earth were receding faster than those close at hand. This observed red shift demonstrated that the universe was expanding from an initial Big Bang. Later evidence also confirmed these observations that contradicted the expectation of scientific materialists and confirmed those of traditional theists. A second point is that physicists have discovered that we live in a kind of Goldilocks universe. Scientists are finding fundamental physical laws and parameters of our universe that have been finely tuned, against all odds, to make our universe capable of hosting life. Now, this points to the possibility that a cosmic fine-tuner exists. Former Cambridge astrophysicist Sir Fred Hoyle argued that a common-sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics to make life possible. And third, discoveries in molecular biology have revealed the presence of digital code in the foundation of life. This suggests a master programmer behind the genetic structure of DNA. Bill Gates acknowledged that DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. These three scientific discoveries all point to the existence of a creator God. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, the host for the Millennial Round Table, and we've been discussing the Chauvin trial and the guilty verdict that was reached last night. And we'll be talking a little bit later about what all that means, what reforms are on the table, what needs to be on the table that's not. But before we get there, we do want to talk about the actual trial itself and the verdict that was reached. It was 12 jurors, and they withstood a lot of evidence and scrutiny. And Jonathan, you and I were talking over the break, so I'd love for you to share with our listeners kind of your thoughts on, you said, at best it was negligence, and at worst it was nefarious racism.
Right,
and so
right.
what are your thoughts on the actual verdict that was reached there?
I mean, yeah, and what I was saying off air, I told you I'll gladly say it now. Not only was Derek Chauvin pronounced guilty by the way, within our legal system, this is important. Our legal system did its job. A jury of his peers were selected. They heard the evidence on both sides. A fair trial was offered, which is the right way to do it. And in my opinion, he was rightly pronounced guilty. And one of the realities we have in the 21st century is we can watch a police officer put his knee on the neck of a man for minute after minute after minute after minute after minute.
11 minutes.
Until that man dies. On video, on record. And the eye test says he did. And so there had to be some consequence. That's where the legal system, you know better than I do, that's where the legal system is designed, it's codified to render the judgment in proportion to the nature of the crime. And according to this jury, that's taken place.
Yeah.
And so for the sake of our system and the sake of what we're trying to accomplish, which is justness amongst ourselves and justice for us legally, that was accomplished yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And so the degree of where we're at in the larger journey and all that, I appreciate that's an important discussion. But for what yesterday was, Derek Chauvin on the eye test morally sure did look guilty. Mm-hmm. Whatever was in his heart in the moment, only God knows. But what he did sure did look like he was at best a bad, unskilled police officer. At worst, he hated that man because he was black and killed him for that reason. Either way, the system must pronounce judgment on that. And that's what it did.
Right. And motive does matter, which I think is what a lot of these protests are drawing light to. But it's what you're saying to me, even if the motive wasn't nefarious, George Floyd died.
He did. And
so we have an innocent person in the stance that the way to have, if George Floyd committed a crime, he should have had the opportunity to go through the exact same system and have justice for his crime. Right. And if Chauvin created a crime, he went through the system. And so that was taken away from George Floyd, which is something that I, as an attorney, just always think about, too, is giving criminals the opportunity to face charges for whatever they may be apprehended for or not. What are your thoughts, Ben? Do you agree?
Well, what I think is really interesting is sometimes I like to inform my current political perspective on a historical narrative. So I always try to put it as a cog within the larger sort of perspective. And something that I've been studying over this past year since this has happened is, first of all, we have to remember that this is indicative and sort of an ensign for a larger feeling, especially among young people, not exclusively, of sort of an inherent racism that might be in the system, that is in the system. But what I want to point out is simply this, and I'm curious what you guys are going to say in response to this, is Christianity has been incredible at actually fighting against racism. And we have to remember that that's why this trial is so big, because of the racist overtones. So in the 4th century, for example, Gregory of Nyssa, he launched an attack on the notion of slavery, and he was one of the early great church thinkers. In the 7th century, Christians began to eradicate slavery and abolition through Europe. Mm-hmm. Then in the 9th century, one of my favorite saints, Saint Ansgar, campaigned against the Viking slave trade. Now, that would take a lot of courage to do that, to campaign against the Viking slave trade. Then you have Thomas Aquinas, who in the 13th century called slavery a sin. And then you had Wilberforce, who, because of his evangelical convictions, predisposed and compelled really to literally shipwreck the slave trade. And then Harriet Tubman was nicknamed Moses because she helped her contemporary slaves escape. So since slavery has been eradicated in America, now since, LBJ passing legislation, MLK, JFK, et cetera, we've been trying to really get rid of slavery from the system as sort of an undercurrent. And that's why, for me, and I've taken a lot of flack for this, and I am so thankful that I have, because it's a dinky price to pay compared to what so many have had to pay. And that is, I just really believe we need to do everything we can to stand against racism. And again, this is Millennial Round Table, so there's a millennial perspective.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I love the millennial perspective. I think that's true. I think it's something that millennials, I think one thing that almost, I don't know if it defines our generation, but it's definitely something I notice among our generation is that they want to be justice warriors. It's not always channeled in the right directions. Right. But the goal is to seek justice. And in the area of racism, I would say eradicating racism absolutely is something as Christians, as millennials, that we should channel that towards. I mean, the Bible says that God doesn't recognize Hebrew or slave or Jew. And so knowing, we care about this issue. The question is, what do we do about it? And I think that's what I always try to translate. Of course we care as Christians about our brothers and sisters. Of course, as Christians, we care about unity and justice and love and grace for the sake of pointing back to Christ, right? For the sake of someone higher than ourselves, not just ourselves and being righteous for the sake of being righteous, but for the sake of glorifying the Lord. But when we're talking about issues like this, it's hard to know where those lines are. And it's hard to know, we hear, President Biden speak about, we hope the right verdict is reached right before the jury's about to reach a verdict, which definitely tampers with trial and I think could create a mistrial on appeal or some issues on appeal. Then we had Maxine Waters, who came out and said, we want you to be more confrontational if he's not found guilty. And so we have violence on the streets. We have cans of soup being thrown at police officers who are just there to maintain law and order, because if they get caught with the soup, it's easier to defend than a brick. And the defense is, it's soup for my family. Right. And that's a common fact. It's a known fact for boots on the ground dealing with the rioters. So I want to say, yes, we want to eradicate racism. Right. We want to create systems and have systems that have accountability in place. What does that look like? And how do we do that in a way that isn't burning the streets, isn't burning down my neighbor's convenience store or Apple store, any store? How can we do this in safe ways that don't call for violence in the street? And I'm concerned that I'm hearing some chatter, through the web that they're affirmed in the writing. Look what the writing got us. And I think that's cause for concern, because when the rioting was on January 6th and the rioting got out of hand, that was widely condemned by everybody. But when the rioting involves race, there's an exception there. And I think violence of any sort is not speech. Violence is not protected speech. And we need to think about these things. So what are some of the reforms? I do want to talk a little bit about those. One of the things that I always really want to educate people on is the unionizing of the police force has led to years of problems. And so many of these police officers, I believe I read somewhere that Chauvin had over 5 race complaints against him. But he was unionized, so they couldn't touch him. They couldn't decrease his pay. They couldn't remove him. He was unionized and insulated from that. Well, I think that creates a problem. So where Democrats are more proponents of unions traditionally, conservatives say if you de-unionize, now these complaints rise to the surface. Now we're not really insulating. If there is racism and it is institutionalized, we're not instituting institutionalized sexism or racism or any of the issues that are happening on the streets, because no one's protected by their union. So that's one thing. Conservative philosophy also is a high proponent of decreasing exemption from lawsuit. And so saying if you're a public officer right now, you're exempted from lawsuit unless it was a clear violation of the Constitution. Well, killing someone in this context should be a clear violation of the Constitution. And so that would be another legal mechanism for recourse and justice. And so we've got to look at the things that are currently in place. We are going to go to a break in just a second. When we get back, let's talk about more of these potential reforms or ways that the system could be rectified and then maybe revolutionized if you're looking at even going further and how far to extrapolate these issues, because there are some pretty big reforms on the table coming from all sides, but some of them are going to come from the left. So stay tuned. Don't forget to go to pointofview.net to read these articles, or you can watch us live at Point of View Radio on Facebook. Our call lines are open, so you can call us if you want to talk to us. Tell us our millennial perspective is right or wrong. We're open to feedback at 800-351-1212. 800-351-1212. We'd love to hear from you, but stay tuned either way.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for Point of View on the Millennial Round Table, and I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Teague, who is the Minister to Married Adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. Thanks for being here, Jonathan.
It's great to be here, Chelsey.
Great. And on the line, we have Ben Courson, and he's joining us by phone. So thanks for being with us, Ben.
Thanks for having me, my friends.
Yes, we're having a great conversation, I think, about the jury verdict that was rendered in the Chauvin trial yesterday. Then we, of course, talked about it into a broader context of some of the reforms we can do. We talked about there are a number of systematic reforms that could happen that would maybe be a little bit, for me, more incremental in an approach to say, if there is an issue, what are some ways, no matter what the issue is in an institution, that we could foster a healthy, legal, positive reform in that institution. So I was noting, deunionizing police, I think I love the idea of deunionizing anything because it becomes more of a meritocracy that way. Many of the officers who have issues have had multiple racist complaints filed against them, but unions insulate them from the institution doing anything about it. And so making it way for there to transparency is always a good idea for me. Decreasing some of those basic things I think would help rise truth to the surface and allow issues to be dealt with more publicly. And then, of course, decreasing, for me, some of the legal liability exemptions that are judicially created. I fought those a lot when I did religious liberty work. We would have a police officer do something really unconstitutional against a street preacher or anybody, and then they couldn't be sued. Because of the liability protections there. And I know that Justice Thomas has said it might be time to reconsider those. Those are all conservative ideas and principles. So I never want the left to own this because I think we have a lot of ways to improve the system through conservative ideals. But in the broader context on the left, some of the ideas coming out are not just defunding or reallocating police department money, which was corrected by some of the Democrat members of Congress this week. They said, no, don't reallocate your budgets where you keep the same police force. They're saying a full defunding of police forces that are out there. And President Biden, who sent thousands of National Guard to these cities to protect them from rioting and protests, instead of calling them National Guard, he called them peacemakers. We've been talking a little bit about rebranding and redefining words. And so police officers were sent, and National Guard were sent in the droves to these cities to try to help protect them. The cities were boarded up. They were shut down early. Curfews were in place to protect them from rioters. But instead of calling that what it is, they're rebranding it as peacemakers. And so it's a little bit confusing to say, all right, we're sending the peacemakers, but some of the left also wants to fully defund police forces. Ben, we're going to start with you. What are your thoughts on, some of these incremental changes or the more revolutionary changes that are before us? Or do we need change?
Well, it's interesting because I just read the Communist Manifesto by Engel and Karl Marx.
Just some light reading.
It's so interesting light reading. So when I talk about our need to eradicate racism, and immediately people think I'm a Marxist, and I'm like, I'm not a Marxist. Like my goal is not to pit the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, nor is it to inflame hatred. Like, even when because to be honest with you guys, and I've been very vocal about this, I was one of the people who is peacefully protesting on the streets, and the people that I met were incredibly kind and loving. And I think that people immediately think, oh, well, you're standing in solidarity with the rioters, when that simply isn't the case. So, Christianity throughout its history, one of the most important and integral germane things it did for the classical world is it brought this idea that because God loves humans, as a result, we're to love one another. So when I talk about really stemming the tide of racism that's even inherent in institutions, I'm trying to do so in a loving way. So I was even talking to a Black conservative pastor, and I said, what do you think about this whole thing? And he said, we do need police reform. We do need reform, is what he was saying. But we want to do so in a loving way. So I think you either get pitted as like silent, or if you do speak out on racism, suddenly you're a Marxist. And I'm saying, are those our only two options? Like, I think that we do need police reform. Police need to focus on the few people in communities causing violence, causing chaos. Officers need to be held accountable in a very transparent way. There has been a history of a lot of abuse, even if you look back to the civil rights movement caused by law enforcement. But I'm thinking of 2-3 police officers that I know just offhand that are my friends that are incredibly loving and incredibly kind. So I think there's a way to do this in a loving manner.
I love that you're saying that. It gets to the real heart of the issue. And, it's things like we heard a caller last year. We were talking about this issue when all this arose. And some of it could be simple, like police officers living in the communities they're protecting would help them not be as far removed from the issues inherent in that community is facing, help them understand and be maybe more empathetic or sympathetic. But at the other side of that, then there might be some more safety issues for that officer. So you've got to think through these things. But I love what you're getting to, which is the heart of the issue. And we have a caller from Georgia on the line who also wants to discuss that very thing. So, Alex, we're going to go over to you, Alex. Thank you so much for calling in to give your perspective. Go ahead and give us your perspective.
Thank you, Chelsey, for allowing me to speak with you. I'm going to try to make this short. I have a very different perspective than yourself and your guests. I believe that racism in America cannot be fixed with reforms or programs because racism is a sin issue. It's a heart issue. It's not unique to the United States. It happens worse in other countries. So I'm not overlooking the fact that it is a huge problem. But to really get at the heart of racism, it's a spiritual issue. Mm-hmm. And I think that praising court decisions such as this, where there's more to it than just racism, there's a lot of things to consider, and I don't think that George Floyd was completely innocent. That trying to fix something by trying to make it swing the other way because of a wrong, and a lot of times makes it worse. So the woke, like I said, I could talk forever and ever. I'm not going to try to talk forever.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your perspective with us. Definitely. We are talking about a lot of different perspectives, but I do think that, Ben, you hit that on the head when you were talking about the heart issue and the history of this as an issue going on. But Jonathan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I appreciate Alex's perspective. And I think Ben and I would both say as pastors, that's our day in, day out. Like the job description is spiritual change, right? Like that's what we're in this for from a ministry standpoint and for believers in general. And if you do, like Ben said earlier, and I love that, and he and I have talked about this offline about just the importance of story and narrative. You follow the Christian story, Chelsey, and it is one of people working in and amongst and around and with communities to see not just political, civic, legal change. That matters. Mm-hmm. It's symptomatic, though, of when people's hearts do shift on an issue. Mm-hmm. And here's interesting.
That's a great point.
I think it's interesting. The American mind is perhaps changing right now. But here's the real, maybe not just question, but prayer request in one sense, kind of go old school as Christians here. Is the American heart changing? So are we dressing up legal formalities and reactionary decisions and, what we see in and out of the streets? Or is there a real I wrote this down just thinking about this a second ago. Is there a community dissonance, though? Like, have we been so staunch about policing our neighborhoods but to your point, I mean, one politician put it another way in a quote in the article you sent us. It's like, this is a great step, but the idea that police misconduct has been solved is a misnomer, because we haven't bridged those gaps. Mm-hmm. Well, wait a minute, though. You're telling me that it's the cops' job by themselves to bridge those gaps? Like they're on the island to fix that? Maybe there's a larger question here within our communities we're not asking. Yeah. And so as Christians, our minds should be right on this issue, but man, if we're not seeking heart change in our conversation, our interactions together about moving that dial towards a more Christ-centered approach to the fact that here's the bottom line. You shouldn't hate people because they look different than you. You shouldn't hate people because they're a different race than you. Like if you can't get excited about that as a Christian, I'm not sure what Bible you're reading.
Well, I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying. We're going to go to a break here, but before we do, I'll just say this last note is that I have seen a heart change and a lot of evaluation in churches. Churches are preaching about this from the pulpit.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've seen a lot of Christians really do a deep dive in their communities, but it wasn't because of the rioting and the protests. It's because of the video. It's because people saw it, and as humans, we're drawn to that. So stay tuned. When we get back, we are going to stay on the race issue, but we're actually going to switch to Planned Parenthood and racism. So stay tuned right after this break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back for our final segment today on the Millennial Round Table. I'm joined by Jonathan Teague here in studio, and we've been having a pretty robust discussion about racism in America and the heart of America. And we just are going to wrap that up a little bit and move on to talk about racism and Planned Parenthood. But before we do that, Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add about the Christian response to yesterday more specifically?
Yeah, there's this verse in Proverbs that says, be quick to listen. And actually, James the Apostle talks about that. Be quick to listen. I think the most important thing we can do, this is just my personal perspective on this, but I found it so efficacious and fruitful for me, and that is just asking my Black friends about it. Like, because it's one thing for me as a white male to talk about it, but I just want to ask, like, my Black brothers and sisters, my Black friends about it, and it's incredibly enlightening. But here's what I found. A lot of them have the same perspectives, and here's what I've kind of been gathering and garnering, and that's this. That a lot of times when we're speaking against racism and they're saying, yes, this is a real thing, what gets affixed and attached to it is a lot of political baggage that they're like, wait, I'm not saying I want all this other stuff attached to it. Like, for example, when we say racism is a problem, racism is wrong, then suddenly you have all this baggage and all this rhetoric and all these linguistics and all these political partisanship sort of aspects that are attached to it. And that's why I just think it's so important that we can stand up for what's right without a lot of the subtext being unnecessarily like sticking to it. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. I love that, because we're going to turn to an issue which I think should be bipartisan on racism. It's not just in what you're saying, like how polarized everything is. And so as background, Planned Parenthood was founded by Margaret Sanger. She's the founder. And Margaret Sanger was a eugenist at the time. And Justice Clarence Thomas, say that 5 times fast. He actually had just this really devastating but moving concurring opinion where he talked about the history of eugenics and abortion and how it's been used as a tool by eugenicists to eradicate minorities from our communities and populations. And it's just a known fact. Margaret Sanger was famous they opened in Brooklyn, the first Planned Parenthood. And at the time she said, if we can get the Black pastors on board, and if we repackage this and return the coin for abortion as family planning, then we'll get their buy-in. And so she was extremely nefarious, racist, who wanted to, and this is her word, remove the unfit. And the unfit is a major theme for eugenists. They were also against anyone who's born with birth defects or anyone who had genetic fetal abnormality. There's a whole host of class, even criminals. They wanted to she supported a case that would sterilize criminals. So really horrible, heinous roots of Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood, our organization, I'm the state director and national legislative advisor for Human Coalition Action. And we do pro-life legislative work, and work on behalf of women who find themselves pregnant and in need of help. We advocate for both the preborn children and their mothers who need help. And so this is an issue that's close to us because my executive director, he's with the Douglas Leadership Foundation, and he is Black, and he wrote a letter to Planned Parenthood with over 100 Black pastors last year saying, renounce Planned Parenthood and for their racist roots, like renounce your racist roots. And they didn't. They sat on it in this climate we're in for a year, and they sat on it until now. And they finally acknowledged that she had racist roots. They didn't get into any of the history I just discussed with you. They said that we think that she was a eugenist, and that's a part of our history. And she did speak once to the Ku Klux Klan to talk about birth control against the unfit, and none of that's good. So we specifically renounce her, and that's fine. But my issue is, it entirely failed to acknowledge that the abortion industry, the entire industry, is the tool to accomplish eugenist goals.
Right.
I mean, half the Black population is missing because of abortion. We would have talk about representation. We would have twice as many Black brothers and sisters among us if it wasn't for abortion. In Brooklyn, to this day, you're more likely to be aborted as a Black child than born alive. And that's devastating. And the same is true of general minority communities being targeted by abortion. There's a lot of non-discrimination bills going forward right now. The Down syndrome abortion rate is exceedingly high. 80% of Planned Parenthoods to this day are within walking distance to minority communities. And none of that's being changed or talked about, that you were a tool to bring about this result, and that killing children is always wrong. But there's just so much here to unpack from a moral standpoint. And I've unpacked a lot. So, Ben, I'm going to start with you because we've got a few minutes left of this segment, and say, when you read this article, what were your thoughts? Anything stand out to you?
Well, I just think, again, it speaks to this issue of racism that we've been talking about initially. And I kind of want to put a biblical perspective and spin on this. And then, Jonathan, I'd love to hear the last word from you too as well. Sure. But it's interesting. We heard from an earlier caller that this isn't so much a political issue as much as it's a heart issue. But here's what I would say. It begins in the heart, but when our heart changes, that should actually change policy. So one of the things I love about what you guys do is you both believe racism is wrong, and you stand up for the sanctity of life. So I think there's a way to do what the early Christians did. Like, I think about Deuteronomy 23, even in the Old Testament, pre-Christian, it was talked about how slave catching was a sin. Paul told Timothy this. Moses said that you're not to return an escaped slave to his master. Jesus literally inhabited the slave role when he washed feet. Crucifixion was usually for slaves. Like I said, William Wilberforce, with the abolition of the slave trade, when he did that, Christianity in England was at a low ebb, but because of his governmental policy, it really put Christianity on the map in a very positive light historically. The Old Testament bans slave catching, provides protections for slaves, etc. So all these things that the Bible did that then inspired the abolition of the slave trade, and even Martin Luther King Jr. then fighting against systemic racism in the heart even. In the 60s, he was a Baptist preacher. I think we need to continue to fight that good fight.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. King said, right, it's not the color of your skin, but the content of your character. And somehow there's a mission drift that I think is taking place within the larger narratives of what we mean by racial reconciliation and racial harmony. And I think that we're slowly but incrementally, and maybe even intentionally in some sectors of culture, we're losing that script on purpose. And what happens is we're reverse engineering, backing away from racial reconciliation when we codify, for instance, with the abortion issue, family planning or women's health, which is all cryptic and evil code language for the inconvenience of a child. That's really what we're talking about. And the fact that, sure, we can, this is for another day segment, right? But, the infrastructure reboot, right? Planned Parenthood's going to get some money through that. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Right. So when we start, Ben's right. When we start talking about connecting with people's hearts, about valuing life and recognizing that the God of the Bible, if you're a young adult listening to this, I got to say this. If you're a young adult that's not sure about church, or you've walked away, or you're just mad about Christianity, what you think it's been all about, remember, the God of the universe created life and the world and you. And he's the same God today that he was for Abraham and Moses and in the garden. And he actually cares about your life, even when you were in the womb.
And you know what? I think we're all hitting on it here, that just like we have inherent dignity because God created us, and he created us with a purpose, and that purpose is good and worthy, and it should be to serve him. And so regardless of whether that issue can manifest in racism, if it manifests through killing children, through abortion, all of that's wrong because we are human and made in his image. And we're all on the same page there. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I so appreciate it. Ben, real quick, where can our listeners follow you?
You can just go to bencourson.com or type in Hope Generation to Facebook or Instagram or YouTube.
Great. Jonathan, what about you?
Twitter at @Jonathan_Teague. That's me.
Amazing. Well, I'm Chelsey Youman. I'm with Human Coalition Action, and I so appreciate your time today. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Have you ever met a child that you knew would do great things? Perhaps they displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, a zeal for learning. Now imagine you take that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, you feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from mainstream media, and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive the facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.